Okay, let's jump right into this because we are tackling an absolutely massive, sweeping topic today in this explainer. Now, you know the biggest problem with trying to understand history, right? The records are usually left behind by the people who had a very specific interest in how the story came out. We're talking conquerors, enslavers, colonial administrators. So, when we look at the historical record of Black life, we're usually working with a version of events shaped by folks who actually had something to gain from the truth being incomplete, flattened, or just straight up missing. But today, we're going to unflatten that history. We're looking at the actual picture pieced together from modern research, archaeology, and primary sources that actually came from within these communities.
So, the big central question we are answering today is what was Black life actually like throughout history? For a lot of us, the answer we got in school was tragically compressed, wasn't it? It usually gets shoved into this single, short little unit sandwiched somewhere between Thanksgiving and winter break. And honestly, even worse, it usually starts right in the middle of the story, focusing almost entirely on victimization. But that kind of forces us to step back and ask, what was the complete picture actually like?
I mean, just look at the stark contrast here. On one side, you've got the standard curriculum, a super short timeline that usually kicks off with the tragedy of the transatlantic slave trade. But look over at the actual picture. We're talking about 100,000 years of complex, triumphant, and truly global societies. You have to remember, Africa is where anatomically modern humans first evolved. Black history isn't just some extra chapter inserted into a broader human story. It is literally the opening chapter of the human story itself. To cover this incredible sweep of time, here is our roadmap for today. We'll be hitting the incomplete record, ancient states, the architecture of survival, revolutions, global liberation, and finally, an unbroken thread. All right, let's start with part one, the incomplete historical record. Moving right along to section two, ancient states and empires. Shifting away from those early hunter-gatherer roots, just take a look at the sheer scale of accomplishment on this timeline. We are entering an era of immense wealth and power, the kind that completely shatters those old European assumptions. I mean, roughly 3,000 years ago, the kingdom of Kush grew so powerful, they actually conquered Egypt, giving the ancient world a whole dynasty of Nubian pharaohs. By the 4th century, you have the Aksumite kingdom in present-day Ethiopia. They were literally one of the four great powers of the ancient world alongside Rome, Persia, and China. They were minting their own coins and adopting Christianity centuries before most of Europe even got there. Then you see Great Zimbabwe, this massive stone city built entirely without mortar. And of course, the medieval West African empires, like Mali, which basically controlled the global flow of gold and salt. And to truly wrap your head around the almost incomprehensible wealth of these empires, you've got to consider Mansa Musa, the ruler of Mali. During his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, his entourage was so loaded down with gold that his spending spree literally crashed gold prices across the entire Mediterranean economy for more than a decade. Imagine having so much money you accidentally break the global economy. And right within the same empire was the city of Timbuktu, a massive intellectual hub with universities housing hundreds of thousands of manuscripts on math, astronomy, law, and medicine.
Which brings us to section three, the architecture of survival.
Now, to understand modern history, we really have to reframe how we view the transatlantic slave trade. It absolutely wasn't a rescue operation, and it wasn't the beginning of a story. It was the systematic destruction of the advanced civilizations we literally just talked about. And the sheer numbers are staggering. 10 to 12 million Africans survived that horrific ocean crossing to the Americas. Up to that point, it was the largest forced movement of human beings in history. The labor extracted from them generated the massive agricultural surplus that quite literally built the economic foundations of the modern industrialized world we live in today. But the absolutely crucial takeaway here is how these individuals lived and resisted. They weren't just passive victims. They were people making incredibly difficult, highly active choices every single day. Look at how, under conditions of just extraordinary violence, enslaved communities deliberately preserved their African spirituality. They adapted complex agricultural knowledge to new lands, and they completely transformed their music into entirely new forms. They built rich internal social worlds that survived precisely because they were maintained collectively and passed down deliberately. Okay, let's look at section four, revolutions and rebuilding. The whole narrative of docility during this era, it's a complete myth. Just look at the Haitian Revolution, a colony of enslaved people organized and successfully overthrew Napoleon Bonaparte's army. We're talking about taking down one of the most powerful military forces in the world at the time. establishing the very first free Black republic in the Western Hemisphere in 1804. But the backlash they faced was extraordinarily severe. Slaveholding nations completely isolated Haiti, and France came back and extracted the modern equivalent of tens of billions of dollars in reparations just for the quote-unquote loss of enslaved labor. These were punishing payments that Haiti was forced to keep paying all the way until 1947, which severely crippled its economic development for over a century. Following formal abolition across the Americas, we entered an era of extraordinary political possibility, which, of course, was quickly followed by the violent, highly organized backlash of the Jim Crow era. Yet, despite all this terror, intellectual traditions absolutely flourished. Just look at this quote describing the investigative journalism of Ida B. Wells in the 1890s. She documented lynching with meticulous, factual clarity while under genuine daily threat to her own life. At the exact same time, figures like Frederick Douglass were writing first-order political philosophy about constitutional interpretation. These weren't just minor historical figures, they were literally among the sharpest social and political minds of their respective eras. And that immense intellectual firepower is perfectly captured in W.E.B. Du Bois's concept of double consciousness. He developed this at the turn of the 20th century, and it's basically a framework that explains the internal conflict of Black Americans. It's that everyday struggle of having to view your own identity through the distorted, prejudiced lens of a racist society. Even in the face of total systemic exclusion, they were consciously defining themselves on their own terms, leaving us with a highly generative, durable framework for understanding identity today. Now we're moving to Section 5, the global liberation struggle. The mid-20th century brought massive transformations, and they were all deeply connected on the global scale. Check out how this table connects the dots. The U.S. civil rights movement wasn't just some simple moral appeal to the American conscience. It was a strategically sophisticated, incredibly disciplined movement that relied on confrontational tactics and serious economic pressure. They intentionally exposed the violence of segregation at the exact moment the Cold War made American racial practices a huge global diplomatic liability. At the exact same time, we're seeing African decolonization. What was just a handful of independent states in 1945 completely exploded to dozens of new nations by 1970 as European empires fell apart. And running completely parallel to all of this is the South African anti-apartheid movement, where the African National Congress kept up decades of resistance against a brutally elaborate system of racial domination, which finally led to that remarkable democratic transition in 1994. And finally, Section 6, an unbroken cultural thread. To really understand the scope of this epic, we have to weave in the vital pillars that sustained it. And that starts with acknowledging that the global dispersion of Black communities, like soldiers, scholars, and traders living in medieval Europe, Persia, and India, actually predates the transatlantic slave trade by centuries. But when we look at the resistance movements we've been talking about, we absolutely must center this specific piece of the story. These incredible women, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Rosa Parks, Fannie Lou Hamer, Diane Nash, and Pauli Murray, they were the absolute backbone of these historical movements. They were not just supporting characters in some male-dominated story. They were the ones on the ground executing the dangerous, highly sustained organizational work that abolition and civil rights literally ran on. The mothers who preserved cultural practices across generations of slavery were themselves engaging in a profound, deliberate form of political resistance. Another amazing unbroken thread here is religion. Under explicit, violent programs of cultural suppression, enslaved people created syncretic traditions. We're talking about Vodou in Haiti, Candomblé in Brazil, and Santeria in Cuba. They actively, intentionally merged African spiritual frameworks with elements of Catholicism. This wasn't some compromise or corruption of their beliefs. It was a highly sophisticated theological adaptation. It was literally encoded resistance. And similarly, in the U.S., the Black church wasn't just a place to go on Sunday. It was the primary institution for political organizing. It provided the moral language and the actual physical infrastructure for the entire civil rights movement. And finally, we have to talk about the arts. The development of the blues, jazz, soul, funk, and hip-hop wasn't just aesthetic decoration happening in a vacuum. Notice how this continuous, unbroken story of cultural production fundamentally shaped global culture as we know it. These were profound assertions of humanity, created by communities whose very basic human rights were being legally and socially contested on a daily basis. The music wasn't just entertainment. It was genuine intellectual and political work. Ancient, powerful, resistant, creative. When we actually unflatten history, we see that Black life was ancient long before it was anything else. It was powerful, prosperous, and scholarly before it was ever dispossessed. It remained incredibly resistant and organizationally sophisticated throughout its absolute most brutal periods. We are looking at one of the longest, most genuinely global stories in the entire human record. So, having seen the incredible depth of what was built, maintained, and created across thousands and thousands of years, how does understanding this full, unflattened epic change the way you view the very foundations of the modern world around you?